Good evening, and welcome to the Houston Climate Movement. Tonight we're going to be joined by Dr. Earthea Nance. Dr. Nance, I first got to know her through the Coalition for Environment, Equity, and Resilience, and how I see her work is that she is an engineer who is in service to the people. Dr. Nance is an associate professor in the Barbara Jordan Mickey Leland School of Public Affairs at Texas Southern University. And prior to her work at TSU, she was a professor of environmental planning and hazard mitigation at the University of New Orleans, and she received her PhD from Stanford University. She's had a vast array of experiences as a floodplain manager and a board-licensed professional civil engineer. And with that, I'd like to open up the floor for Dr. Nance.
I wanted to talk about climate, flooding, and equity, and they're in an order to kind of talk about how they kind of feed into each other. And this is just a page showing, I have a lot of publications. If anybody wants one or wants to see my publications, I'd be happy to share them with you. You know, as a professor, this is kind of the ultimate, is to write something. But really the ultimate is to actually do something in the world to change it. That's really the ultimate thing. But, you know, in order to keep my job, I have to write this stuff. So the first section is on climate. And so what I have here are, and I'm going to assume that because this is a climate movement, that you guys are pretty advanced on a lot of the facts about climate change. This is just kind of a summary of human activities, which are listed on the left. And then how, you know, what are the direct or the primary climate change impacts on the right? And so these are actually the top of all of our activities, you know, all of civilization. These are the top impacts that create climate change. So power plants, transportation, all fossil fuel combustion, industrialized agriculture and ranching, industrialized fertilizers, deforestation, habitat loss, urbanization, oil drilling, natural gas, landfills, cement, halocarbons and CFCs, and then anything that disrupts the geochemical cycles. So pretty much almost everything that we're doing is creating increased temperature in the atmosphere, particularly through carbon dioxide, but also through methane, and anything that changes the biodiversity, that actually ends up changing geochemical cycles that do have an effect on the earth. And so that's bad. Ocean acidification. So this is just a summary of, like, you know, how are we creating climate change? This is the summary of what we're doing. So this image is kind of to keep in mind that there are different scales. And so, you know, maybe in the past we would flood in Houston, and that was a regional disaster, right? If you had a hurricane, that might be regional. If you had a rainstorm, that might be local. But with climate change, there is now a global input to those storms and those disasters. And so this is kind of, it's not really complete, but it just gives an idea of, if you're at the local level, you know, there could be global or regional causes to what changes you're experiencing. So this is kind of to keep that in mind. We probably read this before, but NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, this is a quote: 2020 stands head and shoulders above all other years in regard to the number of billion-dollar disasters, reflecting the increasing costs of climate change. So now this idea that, you know, climate change really is causing this is all out in the open. It's now mentioned everywhere. It's no longer hidden. It was hidden for a long time. And so in 2020, you know, you remember California, 4 million acres burned in California. You had 30 tropical storms and hurricanes, 3 major tornadoes, 2 major hailstorms. You know, Phoenix was 100 degrees or more for 144 days in a row. You know, we think of Houston as being hot. That's another level of hot. So the total for just the year 2020 was $450 billion in damage and 262 deaths. And this was just record breaking. Here's an image that from NOAA that shows the major disasters that are linked to climate change So drought, heat waves, winter storms, tropical cyclones, which is hurricanes, wildfires, flooding, and severe, I can't see, hold on, severe local storms. Notice that Texas is the only state that meets all 6 types of storms. And these are the worst case storms, the billion-dollar storms. So Texas is quite at risk, more than many others. So how does climate change increase flooding? 3 major ways. It makes the seas warmer, and that's because of the warmer atmosphere. The atmosphere basically touches the surface of the ocean and makes it warmer. And that makes that causes wetter and more intense storms that drop more rain further inland and for longer periods of time. The second way that climate change increases flooding is by rising seas. This is caused by melting glaciers and by the thermal expansion of a hotter ocean. This causes higher storm surge, higher tides, higher floods that cover more land area. The final way is extreme rain. This is caused by increased evaporation. If the atmosphere is warmer, there's going to be more evaporation. And the rain is now more intense, higher frequency, and longer duration for flooding. That last one alone might remind you of Hurricane Harvey because of the unusually extreme rain. So what else causes increased flooding? The way that we develop, the way that we use the land. If we're destroying natural floodplains and wetlands, that's going to cause increased flooding. If we are increasing the amount of concrete and roofs that are basically impervious, that's going to cause increased flooding because of the runoff, the extra runoff. And then if we don't, either by not enforcing regulations or by having inadequate regulations, then land use and development is allowed to go in patterns that are not good for flooding. Also by infrastructure failure. The big levee failure in New Orleans is a big example here. Through lack of maintenance. If you put up a dam, the dams in Barker Cypress is another one. If you put up a dam and you never do any maintenance, at some point it's going to fail and be a risk for flooding. Or if you put up a dam or a levee and you never change it, you just let it sit there, even if you do maintenance, the risk that it's in is increasing over time. But if you never upgrade that levee or that dam, and it just, you think it's still going to give you 100-year protection, it's not. So that's a type of failure as well. So that was climate change. Let's move on to flooding. So as many of you probably already know, there are different types of floods. So there's kind of what they call minor floods, which are no longer minor, but they used to be called minor floods because it would be, be like it would rain and maybe there'd be some flooding, or maybe a high tide. If you're on the coast, you might get hit with a high tide flood. Those are kind of minor. They occur more often than a major flood like a Hurricane Katrina or a Hurricane Harvey. Those are going to have a higher depth of flooding, but they come less often. Unfortunately, with climate change, as we saw in the previous maps, both types of flooding are getting worse, or all 4 types of flooding are getting worse. So I was part of the consortium, the Greater Houston Consortium for Flood Mitigation, and we produced a lot of documents. And one of those documents, I'm just going to summarize a couple of them here, but I put together this idea that there were really three prongs to doing flood regulation correctly. And I'm going to go through each of these. So using a modern flood risk approach. The idea here is that if the data that you have on flooding and the topography of the land and your rainfall data, if that's not up to date, then you're not going to have good maps. You have to be using up to date. And that sounds kind of obvious, but Houston will have this, but we don't have it yet. So a lot of places that are large scale cities that are, subject to flooding are still putting their maps together, still putting their data together. And that's like the #1 thing for modernizing the flood risk maps. Also using probabilistic risk mapping instead of the old way, which was just deterministic. Probabilistic it's just like it sounds, it's going to use methods like Monte Carlo method, it's going to use many, many more samples and give a much more accurate picture of flooding. So if a city's not using that method, they're really behind. You know, they're using a method from decades ago. And then all forms of flooding have to be included. You know, your urban stormwater flooding, your riverine when you've overtopped the levee flooding, your tidal flooding if you're in places like Miami that have that, and then your storm surge flooding. All of those need to be modeled, not just one of them. There needs to be programs and solutions for grandfathered structures. So a grandfathered structure is kind of a slang term that's used to talk about buildings that maybe in the past they met the requirements, but then as the requirements changed, they just grandfathered them in so that they wouldn't have to do anything. They wouldn't have to spend any money. They wouldn't have to elevate. They wouldn't have to do anything. They were grandfathered in. So you end up with a city that's filled with grandfathered structures that are all at risk. There needs to be a program for that. That can't, you know, that should not be allowed to, you know, continue. And then finally, access to risk information needs to be equitably distributed, including language, including renters, excuse me, so that everyone has the right to know about the risk that they're living in. The second approach is gray and green together, integrated. Gray alone is not enough to stop or to address the flooding issues. It should be coupled with green, which is more cost effective. That can be done by using a combination of regulations and incentives for green, low impact projects. So it's, you know, different places do it differently. Some places use just incentives. Others, they just tell people, here's what you'll do. We're going to give you a, you know, it's by regulation that you'll do it. You know, it's different in different places, but it's got to be official. It can't just be, oh, well, maybe somebody will do it if they want to, voluntary. It should be official. All segments of the population and all lot types should have access to green and gray infrastructure. So in some places, they only make the green infrastructure available to people who are buying a new home. So they're in a subdivision that's all brand new, or that has been redeveloped. And so that is actually an exclusion because folks who can't afford that would therefore not have access to green infrastructure. So it should be equitable. Okay, the third one, land use. So the idea here is watershed level planning with full mitigation. So if development is going to happen anywhere in the watershed, it should be fully mitigated, not partly mitigated, but fully mitigated. The total area to be developed, not just the impervious surface, should be mitigated for. Studies to know what the actual natural runoff is are very important because a lot of the estimates that cities use are not accurate. The regulations should address both the runoff rate, how fast it's flowing, as well as the volume. It should be able to handle multi-day storms, should deal with downstream erosion and increased flooding in downstream neighborhood. So this is a big problem that we're experiencing here in Houston and Harris County, where many of the new developments, you know, in the suburbs, they're using an equation that's actually incorrect, and that's what that image is there on the right. They're using an incorrect, and so as a result, they're building detention that's too small. And so all the excess runoff goes downstream and ends up flooding many of the neighborhoods who are living in the urban area of the city. And so that's why you will hear people will say, well, we've lived here all this time and never used to flood, and now all of a sudden we're flooding. A lot of that is coming from upstream where the detention wasn't properly analyzed. And that's actually a problem that we have that we need to solve. The cumulative effects across the entire watershed should be analyzed, not just the effects at one development site, but you know, the cumulative effects. Also under land use is to use land use controls that are commonly used outside of our region here. This includes ordinances, regulations, design standards that positively control development by saying, you know, you cannot build here because it's in the floodway, for example, or it's in the floodplain, or for whatever reason. But by being able to say, you cannot have that development. This is part of the land use controls that most people use. Buying easements or transfer of development rights, that's what TOD stands for. That can also be used to prevent development, where you just buy a strip of land and just take it out of the possibility of development, or trade the development on this land for development on another land that's not vulnerable. And that's also used for green space conservation and preservation, of which we have very outstanding groups that are doing that here. So now let's move to the equity portion. So I'm going to talk about one attempt at equity, and I'll just keep this on as I speak. So I headed the hazard mitigation office in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. I had a $60 million budget to do flood mitigation all over the city. And the first thing I did when I got to the office was to kind of map everything out and to understand the kind of the lay of the land in terms of eligibility for FEMA money. And I noticed that some areas were eligible for like 5 or 6 different types of grants and loans, and other areas which tended to be poor Black and brown communities, they either were not eligible for anything, or they were kind of barely eligible for something. And so I mapped this out, and I had the state, a couple of people from the state come into my office, and I kind of showed them. And I said, this is a potential environmental justice problem here, because I can't help certain people because of these eligibility issues. So they were not interested in that. They saw this very interesting, but they didn't want to do anything about it. So I, racked my brain, and I came up with a way of mixing projects together. So some neighborhoods might have, lots of strong eligibility and able to meet the benefit cost requirement. And I mixed those with other areas that couldn't meet those. But when I mixed them together, I got super high benefit costs. So I would submit applications with benefit costs like 12 or 10. And so I'm thinking, okay, that's a slam dunk. It only has to be one. I've got everybody's qualified, no problem. And I even had 3 people from FEMA as my tech support. So they were actually putting together the applications. They were doing the benefit cost analysis. So there was no funny business, no doubt that it was done correctly. Every time I submitted an application to the state, it was denied. And I just couldn't believe it. I mean, I've done everything I can. I mean, I think the mixing of the projects, no one had done that, but still I was meeting all of the requirements. So I said, why are you denying me? And my first application was for $12 million. I forget how many homes were maybe 100 homes or whatever. And the state said, well, you were off by $2, rounding error. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, let me put it back together. I'll go back to my FEMA staff. And we did it again. And then they came back and denied it and said, well, it's off by $1. And I'm like, what in the world? So then I contact my counterpart in Jefferson Parish. Jefferson Parish is a suburb of New Orleans. It actually has more population. The guy there, I told him what was happening, and he says, look, I'm going to fax you my application. You fill it out exactly like I did. And so I did that. I made whatever changes were made. So now it looks exactly like Jefferson Parish. They get everything they ask for. They always get approved. Again, it's denied. And so I asked, at this point, I'm kind of pissed. I asked them, I said, well, why is it denied again? I mean, I've done everything. And they tell me, and they actually told me this. They said the state of Louisiana does not accept Excel. They actually said that to me. And so I asked them what they used. And they said, oh, well, yeah, well, we use Excel. But I mean, I caught him there. But anyway, I resubmitted my application. Years go by. Okay, people are dire straits and years are going by. In the meantime, I get a call from 3 Black people who work at the state. They're in the guts of the organization, reviewing the applications. They call me and they say, we would like to meet you at a cafe. And so we meet at the cafe. They hand me an envelope and they tell me, this really happened, I still have the envelope. They tell me, if you ever need evidence for any reason, we're giving this to you. We understand what you're going through and we see it. That's what they told me. Now, eventually, my projects got approved. Eventually. The delay was very painful for people, though, who had been struck by the hurricane. And just to let you know, the average for hazard mitigation grants, the average was 8 years for a person in New Orleans after Katrina to receive their grants, 8 years. So that is my first inequity story. And from that, I took notes all through my time so that I could either write a book or write a paper. And I wrote a paper. This paper is kind of the conclusion of that episode, where on the left are the assumptions that a person would have going in. Like, for example, they would say, well, the repetitive loss list and the flood maps, that provides good information about flood risk. But in reality, when you're there trying to do it, those lists and those maps are not relevant to the actual types of risks that are faced by some people. And they were not efficient for determining eligibility. Also, local communities don't have access to the data that's behind that information. So I requested the data, never got it. They wouldn't give me any of the data behind the flood maps or behind the repetitive loss list so that I could do my own analysis. They wouldn't give the data. So this is an example, kind of trying to change your reality, because it's not really like what you think it's going to be. So for example, you'll hear that the hazard mitigation program offers multiple mitigation options to local communities. That sentence is used by FEMA, by everybody. But in reality, the options listed under the hazard mitigation programs may or may not actually be available to the local community. And the list of options is limited. It leaves out some options that would be highly relevant. In this case, the demo rebuild option, where a house could be completely demolished and then rebuilt in place and elevated, that would have really solved the problem for most of the poorer people. And they took that off the table. So anyway, I won't read through these, but the idea is that I came up, with an understanding for, how to get your head on straight, because what they tell you isn't really going to work if you're actually trying to deal with a diverse community. So my second equity attempt, it's actually that all of us have attempted here. And we're talking about the bond. So in 2018, 85% of voters passed a $2.5 billion bond. And the words, I'm taking a quote from the bond language, equitable distribution of resources was one of the goals. And then in November, Lina Hidalgo was elected, which was a significant turning point. And then in 2019, there was a fight over how to do the prioritization. Lina Hidalgo was quoted as saying some areas would never see a project without these guidelines. Then in August of 2019, the Harris Thrives resolution passes 3-2. And the newspaper says the resolution could accelerate projects in underserved regions. And then in August of 2019, the requirements for the bond language were that equity in project prioritization was required, the use of the social vulnerability index, nature-based solutions, a community task force, and that multiple departments would work together. Those were all requirements of that bond passage. Then in 2019, because of this language, new language was added by flood control, and I'm going to put the language here that was added as an approach to kind of figure out, well, how are you actually going to prioritize? And so this new language which was adopted by Commissioners Court on August 27th, 2019, was in order to deal with the projects that hadn't already started. And so it says, this effort will not remove or replace any project already listed on the bond project list. This effort will not result in the moving of money from one project on the list to another. This effort will not impact any bond projects already started, and this process will focus on documenting the logic to be employed for the prioritization of projects on the bond that have not yet been started. So this language was intended, it was intended to figure out and to try to, I guess, balance what it was saying in the bond with what flood control thought it could do. And so just to continue the timeline, in October of 2020, the commissioners and the mayor select the task force members that reflect the diversity of Harris County. And I am on the task force, just to let you know, full disclosure. And in March of 2021, we all learned that the nation is watching, because this equity in the bond thing had national attention. And so in March, more national attention came when it was announced that a $1.4 billion shortfall for projects in the most underserved Black, brown, and high-risk areas, many of which had not even been maintained for over 30 years. And so that was a shock. It turned out that the funds for marginalized areas had been tied to unreliable federal matching funds, and that Greens Bayou, Halls Bayou, and San Jacinto, watershed, were now 75% unfunded, and those are numbers from flood control. And so now, as of today, flood control is supposed to be submitting a report to the commissioners for how to handle the shortfall. So that's where we are today. So to conclude, climate change is intensifying flood disasters in the Gulf Coast. Best practices for flood management are known, but not often implemented. In New Orleans, having an equity-focused flood mitigation official, that was me, was not enough to overcome inequitable outcomes. In Harris County, data, metrics, policy, votes, and money without strings were not enough to overcome inequitable outcomes. But that story's not over yet, but that's where we are now. In both cases, the traditional pattern of inequity remained despite substantial attempts to end it. So I want to give you this as a really good article that came out 2 days ago by Christopher Flavelle, who's an outstanding journalist when it comes to flooding. He does a lot. And this is an overview of climate, flooding, and equity. So the title, As Warming Fuels Disasters, Relief Often Favors White People.
Well,
He provides—
at 8, but I can eat between now and 8.
He provides— Chris provides in this article, and I can send it, I've got it on PDF. He summarizes the field. He does both interviews with people, but he also looks at the research literature and summarizes it. So this is an outstanding piece. And I really highly recommend it. And it's exactly in this topic that we're talking about. You know, gosh, if climate change is coming and we can't even handle equity in terms of regular flooding, how are we going to deal with climate change and equity? Really, how are we going to do that? So thank you very much. Here's my contact information, and it's time for Q&A.
Great, thank you so much, Earthea. Marshall, do you want to help facilitate Q&A? How should we do that?
Sure, yeah, I'd be happy to. Thank you so much, Dr. Nance. That was really insightful. And I'm gonna just scroll up into the chat, but in the meantime, and I saw some questions, but in the meantime, if someone would like to go off mute and ask a question, please feel free to do so.
Dr. Nance, this is John Beard with Pecan in Port Arthur, Texas. Just want to thank you very much for, I think it was a very good presentation. A lot of what you said regarding New Orleans is a cautionary note for us. During our time on city council when Katrina hit, one of the things, the observations I made that I told my fellow council members was that Port Arthur is not much different in a lot of ways than New Orleans. If we don't learn lessons from that, then we're going to be in the same position. And Harvey proved that to be correct. But I want to thank you for that information and for the insight you gave, that despite some of the best efforts that are taken to ensure equity, to try to promote equity, it's a very difficult task if it can even be accomplished at all. It reminds me of something I read in an article recently, and it says that master's tools cannot be used to tear down the master's house. Now interpret that how you will, but you can't use those same tools that you used to enable yourself to grow and be what you are, and now take those same tools to dismantle the very structures that have created what we have here today. So once again, thank you for that, and for all of that information. Please make your PowerPoint and any other information available.
Yes.
And repost your contact info. I couldn't get my camera on my phone or my pen to work fast enough to get all of that down. But once again, thank you very much, and best of luck to you in your efforts to be our representative for the EPA Region 6 too. You got my support.
Thank you. Thank you, John. I really appreciate it. Those are good insights, and we're on the same team. Thank you.
Thank you, John. So I see a question in the chat that's from Catherine Summerlin. Is part of the problem the lack of open source data from both public and nonprofit partners?
That is one of the problems. You know, if they had given me the data, some people can get the data, and then some people can't. I don't understand it. Like, for example, Jamila Johnson, who works for the city, we had a whole thing once when we realized we had both asked for data and didn't get it, but then others that we know could get it. So the data thing is funky. And so if I had the data that I asked for, I was going to do a serious analysis, almost address by address, so that I could match people with the grants that were available. I had $60 million, for God's sake. I could do so much. But yes, whoever asked that question is right on. That is an absolute yes.
Thank you. And another question from Ed Brown. Should we be building the Ike Dike when we know that the oceans are rising so fast? Wouldn't it make more sense to begin moving developments from the seashores?
Yeah, this is going to be a hard pill to swallow. So if you build, just like think about the levees in New Orleans, you know, they built them and they let them go. They didn't do any maintenance. They fell apart they were poorly designed. They were never upgraded. They were never even looked at. So once you put something, an engineering solution in place, it needs constant care. You're going to have to not only maintain, but, you know, every year look at the risk. Has the risk gone up? We've got to keep making it bigger. If you don't have the money for the whole thing, if all you have is the startup money, you can't do it. It's going to fall apart at some point. And then all those people are at risk. So yeah, at some point we have to have a community or a meeting amongst ourselves, meeting of the minds about this issue. There need to be debates. We need to have, you know, ways to understand it. But this is the future, deciding where to live, understanding the risk. Can you afford to evacuate every year? I mean, you know, whatever it is, can you afford to elevate? You know, how strong are you? Can you rebuild? You know, I mean, these are just decisions that only people can make on their own. But they have to understand what the risk is, because this risk is increasing. And it seems like we were talking about, oh, there's going to be climate change, and now all of a sudden we are in climate change. We're in it right now. It's the scariest thing that there is to me. I'm terrified of it. I don't even know what to do. I don't know where to go. And I'm like an expert, and I don't know where to go, because there's other disasters in other places. You might not get a hurricane, but you'll get a tornado, wildfire. I'm from San Francisco. I'm afraid to go back. I mean, they have fires. That's terrifying to me.
Stephanie's question. I heard that in New Orleans, there were different kinds of levees in different communities. Can you speak more to that?
Okay, so there's about 350 miles around New Orleans of levees. And those levees still exist, and they've all been beefed up, redesigned, reconstructed to the tune of about $14.7 billion. They put it back together, and it's already no longer at 100-year protection. It has either sunk or whatever. The rainfall is now higher, so the level is higher, and it's no longer at the level that they constructed it. Now, in addition to the levees, which could be either concrete or dirt, they have things called floodgates. These open and close, but when they're closed, they serve like a levee. And then they also have these channels because, you know, it's in a bowl. So once it starts raining in the water, they pump the water out through those channels into Lake Pontchartrain. So there's all kinds of different structures in order to keep the place dry. And I don't know how much money people are going to be willing to spend again. You know, that was then. And now, I mean, it's less than 100 years already. So that's what the engineering solution, it's never really complete.
Thank you. Ed Brown, also another question. Why aren't detention requirements tied to rainfall rates? Even though Atlas 14 was adopted, detention rates didn't increase correspondingly.
Yeah, so one of the slides I had was on detention, and I did not walk you through that little complex diagram, but as a member of the consortium, the problems with the detention equations, there's an entire report on that topic. And that's where I got that one slide, you know, that document, that figure came from that report. I would highly recommend. It's called Detention and Drainage Regulations. And it's at a website, houstonconsortium.com. And that's the consortium. We have like dozens of different documents that we produce. And yes, the detention has been too small. We know that. We know exactly how much damage it has caused downstream to the areas that haven't gotten any projects. So this is a real tangled web. The detention regulations, we're in a city and a county, although the county had stronger regulations than the city did, but we're in a place where we welcome development. We don't constrict it. That's been the history of Houston. That's part of the legacy of the Allen brothers who created the city. So it's in our culture not to regulate, not to stop development. It's in our culture to incentivize it. That's a fact. I'm not being critical there. I'm just stating a fact. But when your detention equations are incorrect and creating problems downstream in the watershed, you know, something should be done about that. And they have changed. I think in March, the city came out with a new requirement. I think it's 0.75 acre feet per acre. That's, you know, acre feet of detention per acre of development. But all of the recommendations that the consortium made in that document have not been adopted. I don't know if I answered the question. Ed, did I answer the question? No.
I think Ed, there you are, Ed.
Actually, Dr. Nance, the Atlas 14 in Buffalo Bayou, for example, increased from 13 inches to 19 inches. And so you got 19 inches falling, but we're dealing with 12 inches. 1 acre foot per acre is 12 inches. And so it's not tied at all to, you know, what reality is. So when you got 19 inches falling, but you're only taking care of 75% of 12 inches, you know, you got a whole lot of runoff. You got more runoff than you're taking care of. And so, and we also know that Atlas 14 isn't sufficient.
Right. Yeah, it doesn't even include climate change. But you know what? When we did the consortium, we had so much influence. We were able to exert some pressure, and things did change. A lot of the things that I was recommending, that has happened. A lot of it has. Everything didn't happen, but a lot. I think it's just
the grandfathering. Thank you.
Well, yeah, not the grandfathering, but we got a lot of it taken. We can check off some stuff. The pressure's not there now. When we got to keep the pressure up, you know, maybe groups like this, you know, writing letters to the editor or something. There's got to be pressure. They know what to do. It's just the pressure to do it. Yeah. because we wrote it all down and gave it to them.
Yeah.
You know, but yeah, this is just about being able to articulate the problem, coming up with a group that can write and can, you know, not afraid to maybe go on TV every now and then, and just create some pressure.
Well,
And it's got to be pressure, you know, kind of everybody, pressure from everybody, not just one little small corner of the county, but, you know, mass pressure for the whole population. You know, these are issues that we can solve.
What we found, Dr. Nance, was that Harris County was allowing people to pull property out of the floodplains in order to develop them. And we caught them on one that the developer was particularly arrogant. And we caught them on that and proved to them that that there were errors, and they were such obscene errors that they were really just flouting what they were doing, and they came back to us and said, well, you're not hydrologists. Even though we're engineers, we're not hydrologists. And so they wouldn't take our word for it. And in fact, Harris County took an analysis and actually they had to create blockages and all kinds of things to make the previous analysis come out to be the same. It didn't. The endpoints came out to be the same. Everything in between was completely different.
The battle continues.
Yes.
It's a battle, and at some point, it's who has the best lawyer.
Well,
because the city is afraid of getting sued again.
yes.
They have lawyers.
Yes.
And so that's what sets the policy. The policy is not being set based on engineering or what makes sense, the rational. It's being based on being afraid of the lawsuit. And so, you know, just complicit, you know, being complicit or just doing what they need, what they want you to do.
Right.
You know, so this is the boat people are in terms of if you're a city official, you have a powerful group that can pressure you to do what might not be a good engineering, you know, sense to do. So we need to pressure them on the other end. You know, I don't know. I don't know how to solve this. I see the battle happening. I just keep repeating over and over again what makes sense. In every venue I'm in, it's the truth is the truth. This is how you should do it, blah, blah, blah. Other cities have done it, it works. These questions are known. How do you do this correctly? It's known. This is not rocket science or anything. It's all about political pressure.
Dr. Nance, the biggest problem is the developers in Houston have been allowed to run rampant without any constraints. Now you have managed to get some constraints, but how do we address that? I mean, developers live here too. They've got to understand that, you know, flooding happens to all of us. They can't escape it.
Yeah, I feel like we need to have long conversations with each other. Like, I'm very frustrated. It's not enough to be the voice in the forest and have the money and the tools. It's not enough to have voted for the bond equity. That's not enough. That's one of those two examples I gave you. We should be, you know, it's shocking that, you know, the community says we want to do this and we still can't do it. How do we solve that? That's the question that you're asking.
Right.
I don't know. And we had the political shift that happened, so that it was 3-2. So you're thinking, okay, we're getting to do what we want to do, make it equitable. This is a big, I don't know. I can't answer it. And all I could do is keep being a voice of reason, but I don't know how to solve this. I don't.
It's frustrating.
Well, thank you, Dr. Nance. I know it's 7:55 and there's still a couple of questions in the chat that we haven't gotten to. So I just want to be respectful of your time. So maybe I'll just ask one more question. Could you, since you're talking about like other cities that have done it and done it right, I'm just curious to see like if you if you could maybe give us some examples of that, and then going to Colleen's question of like, can you talk about how the city of Houston and Harris County work together or not on stormwater flood mitigation projects?
Yeah, so Tulsa, Mecklenburg County, North Carolina, King County, Washington, those are named a lot for three, examples of good floodplain management, especially Mecklenburg County, North Carolina. That's probably the leading one. So those are three examples. And then what was the other question?
Could you talk about how the city and Harris County work together or don't work together on stormwater flood mitigation?
And by the way, when we had the consortium, we brought those people here. We took them on tours, they saw the problems, we talked about it. So we were influenced by them. So they were here. So Houston, the county and the city. So after Hurricane Harvey, you might remember that there were increases in the base flood elevation. They were immediately changed in Chapter 19 of the city ordinance. And that Houston, Harris County did it first, pressuring city to do it also. They did not match it completely, but they kind of came up really close to it. And I think that Harris County was BFE plus 3 feet, and then Houston was BFE plus 2 feet, something like that. So that's one instance where they were kind of both going in the same direction. This detention issue is unanswered at this point. They need to, and I think that the document that came out by the city in March on detention, where they changed their detention, was to try to get in alignment with the county, but it was still not complete alignment, but to come closer to it. So those are two examples of the city trying to catch up to the county. Yeah, it would be nice if the jurisdictions were a little bit more aligned, if they work together, and if it was easier for people. We even recommended if the county, like platting and permitting, if they could all, county and city, be in the same building, so that when you go in with your documents, you wouldn't have to drive across town or something. We recommended that. There's so much they can do. There is more that they could do.
That's true. Thank you so much, Dr. Nance. And with that, I'd hand it off back to Stephanie. And we really want to thank you for joining today, Dr. Nance. Stephanie?
Yeah, thanks so much, Dr. Nance. Well, we really appreciate you coming to speak with us and sharing your wealth of knowledge with us. And so this talk has been recorded. We have a pretty new YouTube page where we're posting presentations that people have shared with us. So if you don't mind, Dr. Nance, we'll post that there as well, and also send out the PowerPoint slides that you shared. All right, thank you so much.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.